What if the greatest lie in history isn't about who built the pyramids, but when? What if these monuments, these impossible geometric shapes rising from desert sand, stood through an apocalypse so violent it erased an entire civilization from memory? Every textbook says 2500 BC. Every archaeologist agrees. Every museum tour guide repeats the same story. Copper tools, wooden sledges, 4,500 years of settled science. The timeline is tidy, the narrative complete, the evidence locked away in academic consensus. But the stones, if you know how to listen, if you learn to read the language they speak in erosion patterns and astronomical alignments and engineering precision that shouldn't be possible, tell a different story. Tonight, you're going to hear what they've been whispering for 12,000 years. Stand at the Sphinx if you ever get the chance. Run your hand along the weathered walls of its enclosure. Feel the deep, vertical channels carved into ancient limestone. You'll touch something that shouldn't exist according to the official timeline. The unmistakable signature of heavy, sustained rainfall. Water erosion from centuries of seasonal storms. Geologists recognize this pattern immediately. It's written in stone as clearly as any hieroglyph. More clearly, perhaps, because stone doesn't lie. But here's what makes archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Here's the detail that gets omitted from tour narratives and glossed over in textbooks. Egypt hasn't experienced that kind of rainfall in recorded history. Not in the last 4,500 years when they claimed the Sphinx was carved by Pharaoh Khafra. Not even in the last 6,000 years. To find weather patterns capable of creating erosion that deep, that extensive, you have to go back over 10,000 years. Back to a time when the Sahara was green with grasslands and rivers. Back before agriculture, before writing, before anything we confidently call civilization.
Back to a time that, according to everything we've been taught, shouldn't have had the capability, or the organization, or the astronomical knowledge to carve monuments that align with celestial precision, to star patterns that existed not in 2500 BC, but in 10,500 BC. The evidence is there, carved in water and stone, encoded in the slow, patient language of geology. But accepting it means accepting that human history is far older and far stranger than the comfortable narrative we've constructed. 12,900 years ago, something happened to Earth that makes our modern climate concerns look trivial by comparison. Scientists call it the Younger Dryas, a name that sounds almost gentle until you understand what it represents. Within perhaps a single decade, maybe less, temperatures across the planet plunged 8 degrees Celsius. Ice sheets that had been retreating for thousands of years suddenly surged forward again. Entire cultures that had been developing along coastlines and river valleys vanished from the archaeological record as if they'd never existed. Sea levels rose and fell. Weather patterns that had been stable for millennia became chaotic and unpredictable. The Sahara, which had been green and fertile, teeming with wildlife and human settlements, began its transformation into the desert that stretches today from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Forests burned, species went extinct, and human populations, wherever they were, whatever level of civilization they'd achieved, were scattered and reduced, and forced to begin again from almost nothing. The geological evidence for this catastrophe is overwhelming, undeniable, written in ice cores and sediment layers, and the sudden disappearance of the Clovis culture in North America, and the extinction of megafauna across multiple continents. Something happened, something fast and violent and global. and if monumental architecture existed before this event.
If there were civilizations capable of astronomy and engineering and organizing massive construction projects, only the largest and most carefully placed structures would have survived. Only monuments built on high ground, away from coastlines that would be drowned, constructed with such precision and mass that even climate catastrophe couldn't erase them. Only monuments like the pyramids of Giza. Tonight, we're going to walk through evidence that mainstream archaeology has struggled to explain. Evidence that suggests these monuments might be witnesses to a world that existed before the flood myths that appear in every ancient culture, before the climate catastrophe that reset human civilization and forced our ancestors to climb back up from survival mode. We're going to examine the Sphinx and let geologists rather than Egyptologists tell us what the erosion patterns actually mean. We're going to look at astronomical alignments that point not to the reign of Khufu in 2500 BC, but to an epoch over 10,500 years ago, when the constellation Leo rose in the east, exactly where the Sphinx gazes eternally toward the horizon. We're going to explore engineering mysteries that sound impossible. Precision in stone cutting and placement that modern construction companies struggle to replicate. The use of granite containing 85% quartz crystal transported from quarries 800 kilometers away for reasons that might involve piezoelectric properties and energy generation rather than simple decoration. We're going to trace the climate cycles that transformed North Africa from paradise to wasteland and ask what happened to the people who lived through those transformations, who built during the green periods, and somehow preserved their knowledge through the catastrophe that followed. We're going to look at Egyptian mythology itself, at the Tepi, the first time, when according to ancient records the gods walked the earth and established civilization, and ask whether these might be memories of something real. Cultural memories of a time before the flood, when human achievement reached heights we've forgotten. And, if you stay with me until the end, if you follow this thread through all its twists and implications, and moments where everything you thought you knew shifts beneath your feet like sand, you'll understand why the pyramids refuse to yield all their secrets. You'll understand why mystery might be their greatest gift to us. Why not knowing with absolute certainty might be more valuable than the false confidence of settled narratives. You'll understand that these monuments weren't just built to last. They were built to survive apocalypse, to make future generations stop and wonder and question everything. To preserve through sheer mass and precision a message we're only now beginning to read. The evidence won't give you easy answers, won't fit neatly into the timeline you learned in school, but it will show you something more valuable. It will show you that human history is deeper and stranger and more magnificent than we've imagined. That our ancestors were capable of achievements we've systematically underestimated. That the past isn't settled at all, but waiting to be rediscovered by anyone willing to look at the stones themselves, rather than just accepting what we've been told about them. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in this world, whether it's morning or afternoon or the deep hours of night, leave a comment about your time zone, about where you're tuning in from. I want to know if the darkness in your city feels anything like the darkness that falls over the Giza Plateau each night. Moonlight on ancient limestone, shadows pooling in the Sphinx's enclosure, the sound of wind moving across sand, and the patient breathing of stone that has stood longer than empires, longer than languages, longer than any human memory can reach. I want to know if you're sitting in silence like I am now, imagining what it would be like to stand there when the only lights were stars, and the only sounds were the night itself,
and these monuments waiting, patient as geology, for someone to finally ask the right questions. The journey begins with water, with erosion that shouldn't exist, with a monument that remembers when the Sahara was green and rain fell in seasonal torrents, and human civilization might have been something very different from what we've assumed. The Sphinx is calling across 10,000 years, and its message, carved not in hieroglyphs but in the language of geology itself, in vertical channels that only water can write, is about to change everything you thought you knew about the past, about human capability, about how far back our story really goes. Take a breath. Let your mind settle. Open yourself to possibilities you might have dismissed before tonight. And prepare to see these monuments not as tombs from a known era, but as witnesses to an age so ancient that only stone could preserve its memory. As messages from a civilization that survived in legend and myth, and the physical evidence of structures too precisely built, too astronomically aligned, too geologically weathered to fit the comfortable timeline we've constructed. The Younger Dryas is calling across 12,900 years of silence, and the pyramids, patient and eternal, are ready to tell you what they saw. Chapter 1. The Sphinx Enigma. When stone remembers rain. You're standing in the desert at dawn, before the tour buses arrive, before the vendors set up their stalls, before the noise of modern Cairo spills over the plateau. The air is cool, carrying the last whispers of night, and before you stretches the Sphinx, crouched in its limestone enclosure like a sentinel that has been waiting, patient beyond human comprehension, for someone to finally see what it's been trying to say. Your hand reaches out, almost involuntarily, drawn to the walls that surround this ancient guardian, and your fingers trace the deep vertical grooves carved into the stone. They run down the walls like frozen waterfalls, like the memory of rain preserved in rock. And if you close your eyes, if you let your other senses take over, you can almost hear it. The sound of water cascading down these walls, season after season, year after year, century after century. But that's impossible, isn't it? Because Egypt is desert, has been desert for all of recorded history, dry and relentless under a sun that bleaches bone and bakes clay and preserves mummies in sand for thousands of years. The Nile floods, yes, brings its annual gift of silt and fertility to the narrow ribbon of green that cradles civilization. But rain? Heavy, sustained rainfall, capable of carving channels this deep into limestone? That hasn't happened here in the time of pharaohs, in the time of pyramids as we understand them, in any time that matches the official narrative of when the Sphinx was supposedly carved. The traditional story is clean and simple, taught in every classroom, repeated in every guidebook. Pharaoh Khafra, ruler of the 4th dynasty, around 2500 BC, ordered the Sphinx carved from the limestone bedrock of the Giza Plateau during the same grand building campaign that produced his pyramid, the second largest of the 3 great pyramids that define this landscape. The Sphinx's face, weathered and noseless though it is, supposedly bears Khafra's features, the divine guardian watching over his eternal resting place. The evidence seems straightforward. A causeway connects Khafra's pyramid complex to the Sphinx temple. The proportions match. The timeline fits neatly into the accepted chronology of Old Kingdom Egypt. Case closed. Mystery solved. Move along to the next monument. But geologists, scientists who read stone the way archaeologists read hieroglyphs, who understand the language of erosion and weathering, and the patient work of water and wind over millennia, tell a very different story when they examine the Sphinx enclosure. They see something that makes them deeply uncomfortable because it contradicts everything the timeline says should be possible. Dr. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, first examined the Sphinx in 1990, brought in to settle the question of its age using geological rather than archaeological methods. He expected to confirm the 2500 BC date, to add scientific validation to the accepted narrative, to return home with his professional reputation enhanced by having put one more mystery to rest. Instead, he found himself staring at evidence that would make him one of the most controversial figures in Egyptology, that would earn him ridicule from archaeologists and fascination from anyone willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx enclosure walls, those deep vertical channels you're tracing with your fingers in this imaginary dawn, are textbook examples of what geologists call precipitation-induced weathering. Rain falls, water seeps into tiny cracks in the limestone. Over time, those cracks widen and deepen, creating the characteristic vertical fissures and undulating surfaces that Schoch documented in meticulous detail. He compared these patterns to the erosion visible on other structures at Giza, tombs and temples definitively dated to the Old Kingdom, carved around the same time the Sphinx supposedly was, and found something startling. Those other structures show horizontal weathering, the kind caused by wind-blown sand, the kind you'd expect in a desert climate, the kind that matches the environmental conditions Egypt has experienced for the last several thousand years. The Sphinx enclosure shows something entirely different, something that requires a climate Egypt hasn't had since long before any pharaoh ruled.
Since before the pyramids were supposedly built. Since before the first hieroglyph was carved. To find rainfall heavy enough and sustained enough to create the erosion visible on the Sphinx, you have to go back to the African humid period, a time when the Sahara wasn't a desert at all, but a vast grassland dotted with lakes and crossed by rivers. When hippos and crocodiles lived, where now only sand stretches to the horizon. When human populations thrived in regions that are now utterly uninhabitable. That period ended, gradually at first and then catastrophically during the Younger Dryas, more than 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years. Not 4,500, not 6,000. More than twice as old as any date mainstream archaeology is willing to consider for the Sphinx. The implications are staggering, almost too large to grasp. If the Sphinx is that old, then it was carved by a civilization we have no record of. A civilization that possessed the organizational capability and technical skill and astronomical knowledge to create monumental architecture millennia before we thought such things were possible. If the Sphinx is that old, then it stood through the climate catastrophe of the Younger Dryas, witnessed the transformation of paradise into desert, survived while cultures and cities and entire ways of life were swept away by the chaos of rapidly changing climate. If the Sphinx is that old, then everything we think we know about the development of human civilization, that neat progression from hunter-gatherers to farmers to city builders, needs to be reconsidered. But let's slow down. Let's examine this carefully, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the establishment's resistance to Schoch's findings isn't entirely unreasonable. Archaeologists point out that the Sphinx shows signs of multiple restoration efforts throughout pharaonic history, that blocks of limestone were added to repair damage, that the body was carved from softer limestone than the head, which might explain differential weathering patterns, that sand covering the body for long periods could have protected it from wind erosion,
while leaving the enclosure walls exposed. They argue that the causeway connecting to Khafre's pyramid complex is too perfectly aligned to be coincidental, that there's no evidence of any pre-dynastic civilization capable of such construction, that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, but it's certainly not proof of presence either. These are valid points, worth considering, worth weighing against the geological evidence. Science advances through skepticism, through demanding proof, through refusing to overturn established understanding without compelling reason. The tension between geology and archaeology over the Sphinx's age isn't a conspiracy, isn't closed-minded academics protecting their turf. It's the natural friction that occurs when different disciplines look at the same evidence through different lenses and reach different conclusions. Yet, the erosion patterns remain undeniable, visible to anyone who visits the site, documented in countless photographs and studies. The vertical fissuring, the undulating surface, the rounded corners where water has literally dissolved limestone over extended time. These aren't subtle details that require specialized equipment to detect. They're obvious once you know what you're looking for, carved as clearly into the stone as any hieroglyph. Perhaps more clearly, because water doesn't lie, doesn't exaggerate, doesn't record propaganda or religious mythology. Water simply does its work, patient and persistent, leaving a record that geologists can read as easily as you're reading these words. And that record says rain, heavy and sustained, over centuries at minimum, possibly over millennia. Rainfall that ended more than 10,000 years ago when the climate shifted and the Sahara began its long transformation into the largest hot desert on Earth. There's another piece of evidence, quieter but equally compelling, that supports the idea of a much older Sphinx. The head is proportionally too small for the body, a fact that's immediately obvious when you look at the monument from the side, when you see how the massive leonine body dwarfs the human head that sits atop it. Egyptologists have noted this disproportion, but generally attribute it to artistic choice or symbolic meaning, the human intellect dominating the animal nature, perhaps. But what if the explanation is simpler and more radical? What if the Sphinx originally had a lion's head to match its lion's body, carved when Leo the Lion constellation rose in the east at the spring equinox, carved as a massive equinoctial marker aligned to the heavens as they appeared, not in 2500 BC, but in 10,500 BC. What if the human face we see now is a recarving, done thousands of years after the original construction, done by Khafre or his predecessors, who found this ancient monument already weathered and mysterious, and decided to claim it by reshaping its face? Recarving the head to a smaller size would explain the disproportion, would explain why the head shows less weathering than the body, because it's literally younger stone, fresh-cut surface, exposed long after the body had already endured millennia of erosion. It would explain the causeway alignment, explain the connection to Khafre's complex, not because he built the Sphinx, but because he restored it, rededicated it, made it his own, the way rulers throughout history have claimed ancient monuments by adding their names and leaving their mark. This idea of recarving isn't speculation without precedent. Throughout Egyptian history, pharaohs regularly usurped earlier monuments, carved their cartouches over previous rulers' names, claimed credit for temples and statues they merely restored or rededicated. The practice was so common, it has its own term in Egyptology: usurpation. And it makes perfect sense from a political and religious standpoint. Divine kingship requires demonstrating connection to the eternal, to the gods, to the deep past that legitimizes present power. What better way to establish that connection than to take control of monuments so ancient their original builders have been forgotten. To present yourself as the inheritor and restorer of sacred tradition, stretching back beyond memory. If the Sphinx was already ancient in Khafre's time, already weathered and mysterious, already associated with solar worship and divine guardianship, claiming it would have been not just desirable, but almost necessary for a pharaoh seeking to establish his cosmic credentials. The limestone blocks added during pharaonic restorations, the ones archaeologists point to as evidence of continuous Old Kingdom construction, could just as easily be evidence of renovation, of maintenance work on a structure already thousands of years old and showing its age. You're still standing there in the cool dawn, hand on stone that remembers rain. And you're beginning to understand that the Sphinx isn't just a monument. It's a witness. It has stood in this place longer than any written record can confirm, carved from the living rock of the plateau, its gaze fixed eternally eastward toward the point where the sun rises and the stars wheel through their ancient patterns. It has watched the climate change, watched the green land die, watched civilization rise and fall and rise again. It has kept its secrets through dynasty after dynasty, through conquest and restoration, through the long centuries when sand buried it to the neck and only its head remained visible, mysterious and silent above the desert floor. It has survived because it was built to survive, carved from bedrock rather than assembled from blocks, shaped with purpose we're only beginning to understand. And if you listen, if you let the stone speak in its own language of erosion and alignment and patient endurance, it tells you that human history is longer than we've imagined, that capabilities we thought were recent might be ancient, that the story of civilization isn't a simple upward climb from primitive to advanced, but something more complex, more cyclical, marked by peaks of achievement and catastrophic falls, and slow rebuilding from fragments of knowledge that survived. The Sphinx asks questions we're not ready to answer. How did a pre-literate culture, if that's what carved it, organize the labor and develop the techniques to excavate millions of tons of limestone from the enclosure, to shape the remaining bedrock into this massive form, to align it with such precision to celestial markers? Where are the tools, the workshops, the infrastructure of that ancient construction project? Where are the settlements that would have housed the workers, the farms that would have fed them, the administrative centers that would have coordinated their efforts? The archaeological record for the period between 10,500 BC and 8,000 BC in Egypt is frustratingly sparse. Scattered stone tools and seasonal camps, nothing that suggests the population density or organizational complexity required for monumental architecture. But absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, especially when you consider that 90% of ancient Egyptian sites remain unexcavated, that the Nile Delta, where substantial settlements likely existed, is now buried under meters of silt and modern cities, that sea levels have risen over 100 meters since the end of the last ice age, drowning coastlines where civilizations might have flourished. The Younger Dryas didn't just change the climate, it erased landscapes, drowned river valleys, buried settlements under sediment and sand, made the archaeological record of that period fragmentary and difficult to interpret. There's a lesson here, whispered by the stone beneath your hand, talked by erosion patterns that reveal deep time. The lesson is humility. Humility about how much we actually know versus how much we assume. Humility about the capabilities of our ancestors who left us these mysteries carved in stone. Humility about our ability to read the past from the incomplete fragments that survive into the present. The Sphinx doesn't demand that you believe any particular theory about its age or purpose. It simply asks that you look, really look, at what the evidence actually shows, rather than what you've been told it shows. It asks that you consider possibilities you might have dismissed, that you hold the tension between geological time and archaeological time without rushing to premature conclusions. It asks that you sit with mystery, with not knowing, with the uncomfortable space between competing explanations, where truth might be more complex than either side admits. But the mystery deepens because the Sphinx isn't alone. The entire Giza Plateau seems to encode knowledge that shouldn't exist in 2500 BC. Astronomical alignments and mathematical relationships and engineering precision that suggests whoever designed this complex understood things about the cosmos and geometry and the properties of stone that we're only now rediscovering. In the next part of our journey, you're going to tilt your head back and look up at the stars, not as they appear tonight, but as they appeared over 12,000 years ago. And you're going to see how the three great pyramids might be not just tombs, but a map, a message written in stone and starlight, a clock that marks time in millennia rather than years. You're going to discover that the pyramid's alignment isn't random, isn't simply oriented to the cardinal directions, but locked to celestial coordinates that point to a specific moment in the deep past. A moment that corresponds exactly to when the Sphinx erosion suggests it was carved, to when Leo the lion rose in the east at dawn on the spring equinox. The stones are speaking, if you're ready to listen. The stars are confirming what the water has already written. For now, let your hand fall away from the limestone. Let your mind rest with what you've learned. Carry this understanding forward as we move from water to sky, from geology to astronomy, from questions about weathering to questions about why anyone would build these monuments with such impossible precision, unless they were encoding information meant to last through catastrophe and reach distant generations who might finally have the knowledge to decode the message. The Sphinx has been waiting 12,000 years or more. It can wait a little longer while you catch your breath, while you adjust to the implications of what stone and water have revealed, while you prepare to look up and see the pyramids not as tombs, but as something far more ambitious, far more profound, a gift from the past to the future, from a civilization that knew it was dying, to the cultures that would rise from its ashes, and one day, perhaps, remember. Rest now. The stars are waiting. The pyramids are ready to reveal the next layer of their secret. And you, standing between past and future, between what you were taught and what the evidence reveals, are exactly where you need to be to understand what comes next. Chapter 2. Written in the Stars. The Orion Correlation. You're lying on your back now, on the cool sand of the Giza Plateau, far enough from the monuments that they become silhouettes against the night sky, close enough that you can still feel their presence, their mass, their patient watching. The stars are beginning to emerge as twilight fades. First the bright ones, Venus hanging low on the western horizon. Then the familiar patterns, constellations humans have recognized and named for thousands of years. Your eyes adjust to the darkness, and more stars appear. Then more, until the sky is a river of light, the Milky Way stretching overhead like a cosmic road, and you begin to understand why ancient peoples saw the heavens as a mirror of the earth, why they built their temples and tombs and monuments to reflect what they saw above. The three pyramids of Giza stand behind you, massive and dark, and if you turn your head just right, If you let your vision soften and take in the whole plateau at once, you might notice something strange about their arrangement. They're not in a perfect line. Two of them, Khufu's Great Pyramid and Khafra's slightly smaller pyramid, align almost perfectly on a diagonal running from northeast to southwest. But the third pyramid, Menkaura's, is offset, shifted slightly to the east, breaking the symmetry. For years, Egyptologists assumed this was simply a matter of available bedrock, of terrain limitations, of practical construction concerns. But what if the offset wasn't a mistake or a compromise? What if it was intentional, deliberate, a precise placement meant to mirror something in the heavens above? Robert Bouval, a construction engineer with a passion for ancient Egypt and a gift for seeing patterns, asked himself that question in 1983 while working in Saudi Arabia. He'd been studying the pyramids for years, fascinated by their precision, troubled by the inconsistencies in the official narratives. And one night, while lying under the desert stars, he noticed something about Orion's belt, that distinctive line of 3 stars that marks the hunter's waist in the constellation Orion. 2 of the stars, Al-Nitak and Al-Nilam, are almost perfectly aligned, bright and clear, unmistakable markers in the winter sky. But the third star, Mintaka, is slightly offset, shifted to the east of the line formed by the other 2. The pattern was familiar, naggingly familiar. And then it hit him with the force of revelation.
The 3 pyramids of Giza match the 3 stars of Orion's belt, not just in their general arrangement, but in their specific offset, in the precise way Menkaure's pyramid breaks the line, just as Mintaka breaks the stellar alignment. The correlation was too exact to be coincidental, too specific to be dismissed as pattern-seeking imagination. The pyramids, he realized, were a map of the sky, a terrestrial reflection of a celestial pattern, built with such precision that even the offset, the apparent imperfection, was actually proof of intentional design. But the correlation goes deeper, becomes more precise, when you add the Nile River to the picture. The Milky Way, that band of stars that represents the combined light of billions of distant suns, runs through the night sky like a river of light, and in ancient Egyptian cosmology, it was seen as the celestial Nile, the heavenly counterpart to the earthly river that brought life to the desert. The Nile flows through Egypt from south to north, its course visible on any map. And if you overlay the star pattern of Orion's belt onto the geography of Giza, aligning the 3 stars with the 3 pyramids, the Milky Way falls almost exactly where the Nile flows. The match isn't approximate or vague. It's startlingly precise, as if the ancient builders were creating a scale model of the cosmos, placing their monuments to mirror not just individual stars, but the entire celestial landscape. The pyramids become more than tombs, more than monuments to royal ego. They become a message, written in stone, and aligned to heaven. A permanent record of the sky as it appeared at a specific moment in time, encoded in structures massive enough to survive millennia, positioned with precision that ensures future generations might decode the message, if they learn to read the language of astronomical alignment. This is where the timeline becomes critical, where the question of when shifts from archaeological curiosity to cosmic significance. The stars move, not in any human time scale, not in ways you'd notice watching the sky from night to night, or even year to year, but over centuries and millennia. The slow wobble of Earth's axis causes the positions of stars relative to the horizon to shift. Astronomers call this precession, the gradual change in the orientation of Earth's rotational axis, a cycle that takes approximately 26,000 years to complete.
Because of precession, the stars visible at dawn on the spring equinox, that moment when day and night are equal and the sun crosses the celestial equator, change position over time. In 2500 BC, when Egyptologists claim the pyramids were built, the spring equinox sun rose in the constellation Taurus, the bull. The stars of Orion's belt were visible in the southern sky, but their position relative to the horizon, their height and orientation, was different from what it had been in earlier epochs. But if you use astronomical software to roll back time, if you reconstruct the night sky as it appeared not 4,500 years ago, but over 12,000 years ago, something remarkable happens. In 10,500 BC, at the moment of the spring equinox, Orion's belt reaches its lowest point in its precessional cycle, hanging just above the southern horizon at the meridian, the imaginary line that runs from north to south through the highest point in the sky. The correlation between the pyramids and Orion's belt becomes perfect at this moment, not just in the pattern of the stars, but in their orientation, their height above the horizon, their precise relationship to the Milky Way flowing beside them like the celestial Nile. And here's where the Sphinx completes the picture, where geology and astronomy converge in a single moment of cosmic alignment. In 10,500 BC, at dawn on the spring equinox, when Orion's belt hung low in the south, marking the position of the pyramids, another constellation rose in the east, directly in line with the Sphinx's eternal gaze. Leo the Lion, that distinctive pattern of stars that ancient peoples across multiple cultures recognized as a great cat, appeared on the eastern horizon exactly where the Sphinx looks, as if the monument was designed to mark that specific celestial event. The Sphinx as lion, watching the constellation of the Lion rise at the moment when the pyramids align perfectly with Orion's belt, the whole Giza complex encoding a specific date written in the stars, a date that corresponds exactly to the geological evidence of heavy rainfall, to the time when the Sahara was green, to the epoch that mainstream archaeology insists was populated only by hunter-gatherers who lacked the organization or knowledge to build anything approaching monumental architecture. The convergence is almost too perfect, too precise to dismiss. Geology and astronomy and mythology all pointing to the same impossible conclusion, that the Giza complex might be over 12,000 years old, built by a civilization sophisticated enough to understand precession, to track the movements of stars over thousands of years, to encode that knowledge in stone, positioned with such accuracy that we're only now, with computers and astronomical software and a willingness to question accepted narratives, beginning to read the message they left. But let's examine the counter-arguments, because this theory, elegant as it is, faces significant challenges from the archaeological establishment, and those challenges deserve serious consideration. Critics point out that correlation doesn't prove causation, that humans are pattern-seeking creatures who seek connections that might not actually exist, that the offset of the third pyramid could have multiple explanations that don't require invoking ancient astronomical knowledge. They note that Orion was indeed important to ancient Egyptians, associated with Osiris, the god of death and resurrection, but that importance is well documented in text from the Old Kingdom and later periods, not from any hypothetical civilization in 10,500 BC. They argue that the pyramids contain internal features, shafts and chambers, and hieroglyphic inscriptions that clearly date them to the 4th dynasty, that radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in the mortar confirms construction around 2500 BC, that the architectural evolution of pyramid building is well understood and documented in earlier structures, like the step pyramid of Djoser and the bent pyramid of Sneferu. These aren't trivial objections. They represent decades of careful archaeological work, scientific dating methods, accumulated evidence that fits coherently into a timeline supported by written records and artifact analysis. The burden of proof, as it should be, falls on those proposing radical revision of that timeline. And correlation to star patterns, however precise, isn't the same as proof of construction date. Yet the astronomical alignment remains undeniable and mathematically precise, documented by multiple researchers using different software programs and calculation methods, all reaching the same conclusion. The pyramids do match Orion's belt, not as the constellation appeared in 2500 BC, but as it appeared over 10,000 years earlier. The Sphinx does gaze toward the exact point where Leo rose at spring equinox in that same distant epoch. The entire complex does seem to encode a date that coincides with geological evidence of a wetter climate, and with the catastrophic end of that climate during the Younger Dryas. And here's where the theory becomes more nuanced, more sophisticated, than simply claiming the pyramids were built in 10,500 BC. What if the monuments we see today, the pyramids as they currently exist, with their 4th dynasty features and hieroglyphic inscriptions, were built around 2500 BC, as archaeology demonstrates, but built according to a plan that was much older? What if the ancient Egyptians of the Old Kingdom were working from sacred blueprints, following a design that had been preserved through oral tradition or lost texts from the time before the flood, recreating on Earth a celestial pattern that their distant ancestors had encoded in memory and myth? This would explain the astronomical alignment to 10,500 BC, while still accounting for the archaeological evidence of 2500 BC construction. It would mean the pyramids are both ancient and recent, monuments built in historical time according to prehistoric knowledge, structures that preserve information from a civilization that was itself already lost when the first stones were laid. The Egyptian texts themselves hint at this possibility, speak of wisdom from before the flood, knowledge preserved through catastrophe by survivors who became the teachers of the post-Diluvian world. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, but referring to much earlier traditions, describe a time called Tepi, the first time, when the gods walked the earth and established the foundations of Egyptian civilization. These texts aren't vague mythology, they're surprisingly specific, listing names and roles and architectural details, describing how the survivors of a destroyed world came to Egypt and built the first temples, on grounds that were sacred because they marked the locations of even earlier structures that had been swept away. Mainstream Egyptology treats these texts as pure mythology, religious stories with no historical content. But what if there's something else? What if they're cultural memories, stories that preserve fragments of actual events from the deep past, passed down through generations of priests and scribes who didn't fully understand what they were recording, but preserved it anyway, because it was sacred tradition? The Tepi might not be myth at all, but history, distorted by time and transmission, but fundamentally rooted in real events, in an actual period when Egypt was inhabited by people who possessed knowledge that later generations struggled to maintain and eventually lost. You're still lying on the sand, the stars wheeling slowly overhead in their eternal dance, and you're beginning to understand that the pyramids might be a bridge across time, connecting an ancient world to our modern one, preserving information that would otherwise have been lost when the Younger Dryas reset civilization. The astronomical alignment isn't just decorative or symbolic. It's functional, a dating mechanism encoded in stone and stars, a message that says, we were here, we understood the cosmos, we knew time was long and cycles were vast, and we built this to tell you when, to mark the moment that mattered, to preserve, through the coming catastrophe, a record that couldn't be erased by flood or fire, or the collapse of whatever civilization we'd built. The precision required for this undertaking is staggering, almost incomprehensible. To align monuments to stars as they appeared over 10,000 years in the past, you need not just observational astronomy, but an understanding of precession, that slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete. You need mathematical sophistication, the ability to calculate backwards through time, to understand celestial mechanics well enough to know where stars were in the distant past. You need organizational capability, the power to mobilize massive resources over extended time, to maintain building projects across potentially multiple generations, to pass down precise specifications without the kind of detailed written records we rely on today. And, most of all, you need motivation. A reason compelling enough to justify this enormous effort.
A sense that what you're preserving matters not just for your own time, but for the distant future, when people who might not even speak your language could decode the message you've left. What was that motivation? What drove a civilization, if one existed in 10,500 BC, to create this cosmic map in stone? Perhaps they saw the climate changing, felt the first warnings of the catastrophe that was coming, understood from their own records of deep time that such events had happened before and would happen again. Perhaps they were trying to preserve not just knowledge, but memory, the fact that human civilization had reached a certain level of sophistication, that we had understood things about the cosmos and mathematics and engineering that the survivors of the coming disaster might lose. Perhaps they were creating a time capsule, not written in language that could be forgotten or symbols that could lose their meaning, but in the universal language of astronomy and geometry, using the stars themselves as a reference system that would remain valid as long as humans looked up at the night sky and wondered. The pyramids as books written in stone and starlight. The Sphinx as a marker pointing to when the book was written. The whole complex, a library designed to survive apocalypse and speak to whoever finally learned to read it. There's another layer to this mystery, another alignment that suggests the builders understood cycles even longer than the 26,000-year precession of the equinoxes. The Great Pyramid contains shafts, narrow passages that run from the King's Chamber and Queen's Chamber up through the body of the pyramid toward the exterior. And for years, archaeologists assumed these were ventilation shafts, though why a tomb would need ventilation was never satisfactorily explained. But in the 1960s, astronomer Virginia Trimble and Egyptologist Alexander Badawi discovered that these shafts weren't functional for ventilation at all. They were precisely aligned to specific stars. The southern shaft from the King's Chamber pointed to Al-Nitak, the brightest star in Orion's belt, the star that corresponds to the Great Pyramid itself in the Orion correlation. The northern shaft pointed to Thuban, the pole star in 2500 BC, marking the axis around which the northern sky appeared to rotate. These alignments are exact, calculated to fractions of a degree, and they only work for a specific time period, locking the pyramid to a particular moment in history when those stars appeared at those precise positions. The shafts aren't windows or passages, they're astronomical instruments, sighting tubes frozen in stone, creating a permanent record of the sky as it appeared when they were built, or when they were designed to commemorate. But here's where it gets strange, where the layers of meaning seem to multiply. If you calculate where those shafts pointed, not in 2500 BC, but in 10,500 BC, when the Orion correlation is perfect, when Leo rises exactly where the Sphinx gazes, the alignments are off. The stars aren't where the shafts point.
So the shafts seem to confirm the 2500 BC construction date that archaeology proposes, anchoring the pyramids firmly in the 4th dynasty. Unless, and this is where the theory becomes intricate, the shafts were deliberately designed to point to 2500 BC as a construction date, while the overall layout of the complex points to 10,500 BC as a design date, creating a monument that encodes 2 times, the time it was built and the time it was meant to commemorate. A structure that says, we built this in the reign of Khufu, but we built it according to knowledge from the first time, from Tepi, from the epoch before the flood, when our distant ancestors understood the stars well enough to create this pattern and preserve it through the catastrophe that destroyed their world. The pyramids as palimpsest, layers of meaning written over each other, require you to look at different scales, different elements, different alignments to see the full picture. You sit up slowly, sand clinging to your back, and look again at the 3 pyramids silhouetted against the stars. They're no longer just monuments, no longer just tombs or temples, or even ancient mysteries. They're messages, complex and multi-layered, encoded with information at every scale, from the grand layout matching Orion's belt, to the precise shafts pointing to specific stars, to the mathematical relationships between their dimensions, to the choice of materials with properties we're only beginning to understand. They're designed to be read by anyone sophisticated enough to measure them, to map them, to align them with the stars, and ask when this pattern was perfect, when these orientations made sense, when the cosmos looked exactly like this terrestrial mirror. And the answer they give, whispered in stone and starlight, is 10,500 BC, the same date the Sphinx erosion suggests, the same epoch when the Sahara was green, and human civilization might have been something very different from what we've assumed. A time so distant that only the largest structures and the most carefully preserved knowledge could bridge the gap to our present, could survive the Younger Dryas that erased almost everything else. The lesson here isn't certainty, isn't a simple answer that replaces the orthodox timeline with a new orthodox timeline. The lesson is that knowledge can be preserved in unexpected ways, that ancient peoples might have been far more sophisticated than we've given them credit for, that monuments can speak in languages we're only now learning to understand. The stars move in their slow dance, the earth wobbles on its axis, and if you're patient enough, if you're willing to think in timescales of millennia rather than years, you can use those movements as a clock, a calendar written in the heavens that no catastrophe can erase, because the stars themselves, distant and eternal, maintain the record. The pyramids use that clock, reference that calendar, anchor themselves to a specific moment in deep time, when human civilization, if it existed at that level of sophistication, understood enough to encode the date in stone and wait for future generations to decode it. But the mystery expands rather than resolves, because if the pyramids do encode knowledge from 10,500 BC, if they do preserve information from a pre-flood civilization, then what was that civilization? Where did they live? What happened to them? Where are the cities, the artifacts, the undeniable evidence that would settle this question? In the next part of our journey, you're going to descend from the stars back to Earth, back to granite and limestone, back to the physical mystery of how these monuments were built with precision that strains credibility even today.
You're going to explore theories that sound like science fiction. Ideas about the pyramids as machines rather than tombs, about acoustic resonance and piezoelectric properties, and energy generation on a scale that would make them not monuments to the dead, but tools for the living. You're going to examine the engineering evidence that doesn't fit the copper tools and wooden sledges narrative, the precision that exceeds what should be possible, the choices of material that make no sense if the pyramids were simple tombs, but perfect sense if they were something else entirely. The stars have told you when. Now the stones themselves will tell you how and why. If you're ready to consider possibilities that archaeology has dismissed, but that engineering might explain. Rest your eyes. Let the star patterns settle in your memory. Carry forward this understanding that the pyramids are clocks as well as monuments, that they mark time in ways we're only beginning to appreciate, that whoever built them or designed them understood the cosmos at a level we associate with modern astronomy, but achieved without telescopes or computers or any of the tools we think are necessary for such knowledge. The night deepens. The stars wheel overhead in their patient dance. And you're one step closer to understanding what the pyramids have been trying to tell us for over 12,000 years. One layer deeper into a mystery that refuses easy answers, but rewards careful attention with glimpses of a past more sophisticated, more tragic, and more magnificent than anything our comfortable narratives have prepared us to imagine. The stones are waiting. The next revelation is about to begin. And you, caught between starlight and stone dust, between ancient knowledge and modern skepticism, are exactly where you need to be to understand what comes next. Chapter 3. The Machine Hypothesis, Resonance and Power. You're standing now inside the Great Pyramid, deep in its granite heart, in a chamber that has been called the King's Chamber since medieval Arab explorers first penetrated this structure and named its spaces according to their assumptions about function. The air is cool and still, the silence profound in a way that silence rarely is in the modern world. No hum of electronics, no distant traffic, no ambient noise of civilization. Just the weight of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above, and the strange acoustic quality of a space whose dimensions seem calculated for purposes that have nothing to do with entombment. The chamber is built entirely from granite, massive blocks of red granite transported from quarries at Aswan 800 kilometers to the south, each block weighing tens of tons, fitted together with precision measured in fractions of millimeters. The floor is granite. The walls are granite. The ceiling is formed by 9 enormous granite beams, each weighing an estimated 50 tons. And above those beams are 5 more chambers, relieving chambers, as Egyptologists call them, structural features supposedly designed to distribute the weight of the pyramid above and prevent the king's chamber ceiling from collapsing. But if you examine those relieving chambers carefully, if you measure their dimensions and analyze their construction, questions emerge about whether weight distribution was really their primary function, or whether something else, something more sophisticated, was being engineered into this massive granite complex at the pyramid's core. Christopher Dunn, a master craftsman who spent decades in precision manufacturing and aerospace engineering, came to the Great Pyramid with the eyes of someone who understands how things are made, how materials behave, how form follows function in any serious engineering project. What he saw troubled him, fascinated him, eventually
led him to propose a theory so radical that mainstream Egyptology dismissed it outright, but so detailed and technically sophisticated that engineers who examined his work found themselves nodding in recognition, seeing patterns they understood from their own fields. Patterns that suggested purpose beyond anything the tomb theory could explain. Dunn's hypothesis, published in his book, The Giza Power Plant, proposes that the Great Pyramid was never a tomb at all, but a machine. Specifically, a machine for converting Earth's vibrational energy into usable electrical power through a process involving acoustic resonance, chemical reactions, and the piezoelectric properties of quartz crystal. The theory sounds like science fiction until you examine the evidence, until you see how the choice of materials, the precision of construction, the specific dimensions and acoustic properties of the chambers all align with what you'd expect if someone was building not a monument, but a power generation facility. Start with the granite itself. That choice of material that has always puzzled archaeologists, because it makes no practical sense for a tomb. Limestone, the bedrock of the Giza Plateau, was readily available, easy to quarry, adequate for construction, used extensively in the pyramid's outer casing and internal passages. Why transport granite across 800 kilometers of desert? Why invest the enormous labor and resources required to move blocks weighing dozens of tons, when local limestone would serve perfectly well for a burial chamber? The standard answer is prestige, symbolic importance, the desire to use the finest materials for the pharaoh's eternal resting place. But that answer becomes less satisfying when you analyze granite's specific properties. This particular granite from Aswan contains approximately 55% quartz crystal by volume, one of the highest concentrations of any granite source in Egypt. And quartz is piezoelectric, meaning it generates electrical voltage when subjected to mechanical stress or vibration. Squeeze quartz, vibrate it, apply pressure, and it produces measurable electrical current. The Great Pyramid's King's Chamber and the relieving chambers above it contain hundreds of tons of quartz-rich granite, essentially creating a massive piezoelectric element at the structure's core, positioned precisely at the pyramid's center of mass, isolated from the limestone structure around it by careful engineering that suddenly looks less like tomb construction and more like machine design. Now consider the acoustic properties of the King's Chamber, properties that have been measured by multiple researchers and that reveal something extraordinary about this space. The chamber resonates, like a tuning fork or a musical instrument, at a specific frequency around 438 Hz, very close to the F-sharp note in modern musical terminology. This isn't subtle or debatable. You can test it yourself if you visit. Clap your hands or make a sound, and hear the chamber respond. Feel the vibration in the stone around you. Sense the way the granite seems to amplify and sustain certain frequencies, while damping others. The dimensions of the chamber, the ratio of length to width to height, appear to be specifically calculated to create this resonance. And the 5 relieving chambers above, rather than simply distributing weight, form a series of acoustic cavities that would amplify vibrations and direct them downward into the King's Chamber below. The whole structure begins to look less like a tomb with stress relief features and more like a sophisticated resonator, designed to vibrate at specific frequencies, to transform external vibrations into acoustic energy, concentrated in the granite core, where the piezoelectric properties of quartz could convert that acoustic energy into electrical potential. But where would the vibrations come from? What would set this massive stone instrument resonating? Dunn's answer is both elegant and testable: the Earth itself. The planet vibrates constantly, seismic energy propagating through the crust from tectonic activity, ocean waves, atmospheric pressure changes, the pull of the moon creating tidal forces not just in water, but in the solid rock of continents. Most of these vibrations are too subtle for humans to feel, too low in frequency to detect without instruments. But they're there, measurable, constant. A source of energy that never stops as long as the Earth remains geologically active. The Great Pyramid sits on solid bedrock, the limestone plateau that forms the foundation for all three pyramids. And that bedrock would conduct vibrations from deep in the Earth directly into the pyramid structure. If you wanted to harvest that vibrational energy, to convert it into usable power, you'd need exactly what the Great Pyramid provides: a massive resonator to amplify the vibrations, piezoelectric material to convert mechanical stress into electrical current, and some method to extract and use that current for whatever purpose you had in mind. And here's where the internal architecture of the pyramid becomes even more suggestive, where details that have puzzled Egyptologists for centuries suddenly make sense if you're thinking machine rather than monument. The Grand Gallery, that astonishing corbelled passage that rises at a steep angle from the descending passages to the king's chamber, is unlike any other feature in any other pyramid. A space 28 feet high, with walls that step inward in 7 tiers, creating a precise architectural form that serves no obvious function if you're building a tomb, but makes perfect sense if you're building an acoustic resonator. The dimensions and angles of the Grand Gallery would create specific resonant frequencies. The corbelled walls would reflect and amplify sound waves, and the whole structure would act like an organ pipe or a resonant cavity, taking vibrations from below and amplifying them, directing them upward toward the king's chamber, where the granite could respond. Dunn's analysis suggests the Grand Gallery may have contained resonators, perhaps stone or crystal structures that could vibrate at specific frequencies, creating a cascade of harmonic resonance that would ultimately drive the piezoelectric granite core to generate electrical current. But electricity alone isn't useful without a way to transfer it, to step it up to higher voltages, to broadcast or transmit it to wherever it's needed. And this is where one of the pyramid's most mysterious features enters the picture. The sarcophagus in the king's chamber, that massive granite box that has never contained any mummy, that shows no evidence of ever having been used for burial, that is slightly too large to have been brought through the passages into the chamber, and therefore must have been placed during construction. The sarcophagus is carved from a single block of chocolate-colored granite, hollowed out with precision that exceeds what should be possible with copper tools. The walls uniform in thickness, the corners perfectly square, the interior surfaces smooth and true. When tapped, it rings like a bell, resonating at frequencies that interact with the chamber's own resonance, and its dimensions appear to be related to the chamber dimensions through specific mathematical ratios. Dunn proposes that the sarcophagus wasn't a coffin, but a transducer, perhaps filled with crystals or other materials that could respond to the vibrations in the chamber, converting acoustic energy into other forms, possibly acting as a step-up transformer to increase voltage, possibly serving as a capacitor to store electrical charge. The idea sounds bizarre, until you remember that modern electronics use quartz crystals for similar purposes, that piezoelectric transducers are common in industrial applications, that the principles Dunn describes aren't exotic or mystical, but standard engineering, just applied at a scale and in a context we don't associate with ancient construction. There's chemical evidence too. residues found in the pyramid's passages and chambers that don't fit the tomb narrative, but align perfectly with Dunn's power plant hypothesis. Traces of hydrochloric acid and zinc chloride have been detected in the Queen's Chamber, that enigmatic space below the King's Chamber that contains two shafts that don't exit the pyramid, but terminate in small doors with copper handles, doors that have tantalized researchers since they were discovered. Dunn suggests these chemicals are residues from a hydrogen generation system, that the Queen's Chamber might have been flooded with dilute hydrochloric acid that would react with zinc to produce hydrogen gas, a fuel that could be burned or used in other chemical processes, possibly to increase the humidity in the shafts leading to the King's Chamber, because piezoelectric response in quartz is enhanced in the presence of hydrogen or in humid conditions. The southern shaft from the King's Chamber, one of those star shafts aligned to Orion's belt, shows evidence of salt deposits, suggesting that fluids, possibly chemical solutions, may have traveled through these passages during the pyramid's operational phase. None of this evidence makes sense if you're thinking tomb, if you're imagining a structure designed simply to house a dead pharaoh for eternity. But it fits coherently if you're thinking chemistry, energy, industrial processes designed to support the pyramid's function as a power generator. Let's pause here. Let your mind catch up with implications that strain against everything you've learned about ancient Egypt, everything you've assumed about the capabilities of pre-industrial civilizations. The standard objection to Dunn's theory is obvious. If the ancient Egyptians could generate electricity, where's the evidence of its use? Where are the light bulbs, the motors, the electrical devices that would require power? Where are the copper wires, the insulators, the infrastructure of an electrical civilization? These are fair questions that Dunn addresses by pointing out that electrical power doesn't require wires, if you're willing to consider technologies for wireless transmission, concepts that Nikola Tesla pioneered in the early 20th century and that modern researchers are revisiting. The pyramid's shape, a massive geometric form tapering to a point that was originally capped with highly conductive material, either gold or electrum according to ancient accounts, would serve as an antenna, a structure capable of radiating electromagnetic energy into the surrounding environment, where it could be picked up by receivers that wouldn't need to be physically connected to the source. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, his abandoned project for wireless power transmission, used similar principles. A resonant structure designed to tap into Earth's natural electrical field and broadcast power that could be received anywhere within range. The pyramid, built thousands of years before Tesla, might have been doing exactly the same thing, generating power through mechanical resonance and piezoelectric conversion, then broadcasting it through its geometric form to receivers whose design we can only guess at, because they would have been made from materials, metals and crystals, and perhaps organic compounds, that don't survive in the archaeological record the way stone does. But there's another possibility, one that doesn't require wireless transmission or lost receiver technology, one that fits with what we know about ancient uses of the pyramid. If the structure generated electrical fields, if it created zones of ionized air and electromagnetic resonance, those effects alone might have had purposes that ancient peoples would value, even without understanding the physics involved. Electrical fields affect consciousness, alter brainwave patterns, create sensations that range from euphoria to transcendent experience, depending on frequency and intensity. The pyramid might have been a temple in the truest sense, a place where the electromagnetic environment was manipulated to induce altered states of consciousness, to facilitate experiences that priests and initiates would interpret as communion with the divine, contact with other realms, journeys to the afterlife that Egyptian religion so obsessively documented. Modern research into the effects of electromagnetic fields on human consciousness is still in early stages, still controversial. But there's enough evidence to suggest that specific frequencies and field strengths can influence mood, perception, even generate experiences that feel mystical or supernatural. If the pyramid's function was partly or primarily to create such an environment, then the lack of obvious electrical devices isn't surprising.
The purpose wasn't lighting or power tools, but something more subtle. The manipulation of consciousness and perception through fields and frequencies that Stone Age peoples would experience as magic or divine presence. You run your hand along the granite wall of the king's chamber, feeling the cool smoothness of stone polished to a finish that rivals modern standards. And you try to imagine this space in operation, resonating with sound at frequencies that make the walls themselves seem to vibrate. The air ionized with electrical charge, the granite core converting Earth's vibrations into power that flows through the structure and radiates from the apex, serving purposes we can only dimly reconstruct from the fragments of evidence that survive. The vision seems impossible, too sophisticated for a civilization working with copper tools, too complex for an era that supposedly hadn't discovered the wheel yet, hadn't developed writing beyond the most basic hieroglyphs, hadn't created any of the infrastructure we associate with advanced technology. But the evidence is here, in the choice of materials with specific electrical properties, in the acoustic design of chambers and passages, in the chemical residues that suggest industrial processes, in the precision of construction that exceeds what should be possible with the tools archaeology says they had. Either the evidence is misleading, coincidental, the result of purposes we don't understand, generating patterns that only look like deliberate engineering, or we need to radically revise our understanding of what the pyramid builders knew and what they were trying to accomplish. The objections are serious, worth considering carefully before accepting any theory as radical as Dunn's power plant hypothesis. Critics point out that no ancient texts describe the pyramids as power generators, that all Egyptian sources consistently refer to them as tombs, as eternal houses for deceased pharaohs, as places of resurrection and transformation. They note that the precision Dunn describes, while impressive, isn't as extreme as he sometimes suggests, that ancient craftsmen, working with patience and skill, could achieve remarkable results without needing advanced technology. They argue that piezoelectric effects, while real, are generally very weak, producing only tiny voltages and currents, nothing like the power output that would justify the massive investment of resources the pyramids represent. They question whether the acoustic resonance of the king's chamber is deliberate, or simply a byproduct of the chamber's geometry, whether the chemical residues might come from modern contamination, or from uses of the pyramid in later periods, whether we're seeing patterns because we're looking for them, rather than because they actually represent intentional design. These aren't dismissals from ignorance or academic territorialism. They're genuine scientific skepticism, the healthy caution that prevents us from accepting extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence. Yet the patterns persist. The anomalies accumulate. The evidence that doesn't fit the tomb theory keeps appearing in study after study. The pyramid was built with precision that seems excessive for a tomb, oriented to true north with accuracy that rivals modern surveying, leveled to tolerances of less than an inch across a base covering 13 acres, constructed with internal chambers and passages whose dimensions follow mathematical relationships that suggest intentional design
for specific functions. The choice of granite, transported at enormous cost from distant quarries, concentrated in the King's Chamber complex rather than distributed throughout the structure, where it would better serve symbolic purposes. The acoustic properties, the chemical residues, the lack of any mummy or burial goods in the structure, despite its identification as Khufu's tomb. The fact that Khufu's name appears nowhere inside the pyramid, except in some controversial markings in the relieving chambers above the King's Chamber. The evidence doesn't prove Dunn's hypothesis, doesn't establish beyond doubt that the pyramid was a power plant, but it does suggest that the monument's purpose was more complex and more technical than the simple tomb explanation acknowledges. That whoever built this structure understood principles of physics and engineering that we're only now beginning to recognize in their construction. There's a deeper question lurking beneath the technical debate. A question about why ancient peoples would invest such enormous resources in building structures whose true purpose we can barely comprehend. If the pyramids were power plants, if they were machines for generating and broadcasting electrical or electromagnetic energy, if they were temples designed to create altered states through manipulation of fields and frequencies, why? What drove a civilization to mobilize tens of thousands of workers, to transport millions of tons of stone, to engineer with precision that strains credibility even today, all for purposes that aren't obvious, that don't serve the immediate needs of food and shelter and defense that we assume preoccupy pre-industrial societies? Perhaps the answer lies in what they knew was coming, in the memory of previous catastrophes, and the certainty that such events would happen again. If you understand deep time, if you know that climate can change rapidly and catastrophically, if you remember or have records of the Younger Dryas that nearly erased human civilization 12,000 years ago, you might build differently. You might build to preserve knowledge, to encode information in structures massive enough to survive the next catastrophe, to create machines whose function might be lost, but whose presence would make future generations ask questions and search for answers. The pyramids as time capsules, yes, but active time capsules. Structures that continue to function even when their purpose is forgotten, that preserve, through their operation, principles of physics and engineering that words and texts and fragile artifacts cannot convey. If you wanted to teach future civilizations about piezoelectricity, about acoustic resonance, about the relationship between geometry and energy, you couldn't do it more effectively than by building a massive, working demonstration. A machine so precisely engineered that anyone sophisticated enough to measure and analyze it would eventually discover what it does and how it works. The pyramids as teaching tools, lessons in stone that remain available to any generation that develops the science to read them, that asks the right questions and conducts the right experiments. This interpretation doesn't exclude the spiritual dimension, doesn't deny that the pyramids served religious purposes or that ancient Egyptians genuinely believed they facilitated resurrection and transformation. Science and spirituality weren't separate categories in the ancient world. The manipulation of natural forces through technical means was itself a sacred act. Understanding the principles by which the gods ordered the cosmos was the highest form of worship. The pyramid as machine and temple simultaneously, engineering and religion unified in a structure that achieves both technical and transcendent purposes through the same design, the same materials, the same precise proportions and alignments. You step back from the granite wall, your hand trailing across stone that might have vibrated with power, that might have channeled energies we're only beginning to understand. And you carry with you the unsettling recognition
that the ancient world might have been far more sophisticated than we've imagined, that knowledge we think of as modern might be rediscovered rather than discovered.
That the pyramids stand as evidence of capabilities that civilization has achieved before and lost, and climb back toward again, through the long centuries since the catastrophe that reset everything. The machine hypothesis doesn't require belief, doesn't demand acceptance, but it does require consideration, honest engagement with evidence that doesn't fit comfortable narratives, willingness to let the stones speak in the language of engineering, rather than forcing them to confirm assumptions we brought with us. But if the pyramids encode such knowledge, if they preserve principles of physics and engineering from a time when human civilization understood more than we've credited, then what happened to that civilization? Why did the knowledge fade? How do you go from building machines that manipulate fundamental forces to the scattered hunter-gatherer cultures that archaeology finds in the millennia after the Younger Dryas? In the next part of our journey, you're going to follow the climate itself, trace the transformation of North Africa from paradise to wasteland, witness through geological and archaeological evidence the catastrophe that reshaped the planet and scattered human populations. See how even the most advanced civilization could be reduced to survival mode, could lose everything except the largest monuments and the most carefully preserved fragments of memory. You're going to understand why the archaeological record looks the way it does, why we find so little evidence of sophisticated pre-flood cultures, why only stone survived when everything else, cities and libraries and all the infrastructure of civilization, was swept away by climate chaos. The pyramid has told you what it might have been. Now the Earth itself will tell you why that knowledge was nearly lost, why only these massive stone witnesses survived, to puzzle and challenge us across the gulf of 12,000 years. Rest your eyes. Let the granite chamber fade from imagination back into the darkness from which these visions emerged. Carry forward the understanding that ancient engineering might have purposes we're only beginning to recognize, that monuments can be machines, that religion and science need not be separate, that the past refuses to fit the simple stories we've constructed to contain it. The stones have spoken in the language of physics, of acoustics and piezoelectricity and precision engineering, and whether you accept the power plant hypothesis fully, or simply recognize that the pyramid's purpose remains mysterious, you're closer now to understanding that these structures preserve knowledge in their very form, that they're designed to make us question, to make us measure and analyze and reconsider what we thought we knew about human capability across deep time. The catastrophe is waiting, the climate story that explains why so much was lost, why only the largest monuments survived, why the past sometimes feels like a foreign country whose language we've forgotten, but whose architecture still stands, massive and mute and magnificently complex, waiting for the day when we finally learn to read what it's been trying to tell us all along. Chapter 4. The Green Sahara, Paradise Lost. You're standing on the edge of what feels like eternity, the Sahara stretching before you in waves of sand that ripple toward a horizon shimmering with heat, a landscape so hostile to life that you can barely imagine anything surviving here, let alone thriving. The sun beats down with an intensity that makes the air itself seem to vibrate, and the silence is absolute, except for the occasional whisper of wind moving across dunes that have stood in roughly the same configuration for thousands of years. This is desert in its purest form, one of the driest places on Earth, where rain might fall once in a decade, where the only water comes from underground aquifers, laid down in some distant past when conditions were very different. But what if I told you that 10,000 years ago, you could have stood in this exact spot and heard the sound of rushing water, felt rain on your face, watched herds of elephants moving through grasslands that stretched to the horizon. What if this wasteland was once paradise? And what if the catastrophe that destroyed it also erased almost every trace of the people who lived here, leaving only the largest monuments to whisper their story? The evidence for a green Sahara isn't speculation. It's carved into rock faces throughout the desert. In the Tassili Najr Mountains of Algeria, in the Caucasus Mountains of Libya, ancient artists left paintings that depict a world utterly alien to today's landscape. Images of cattle herding, of people swimming, of boats on water that no longer exists. Elephants with their trunks raised, giraffes browsing on trees, hippos wallowing in rivers that vanished millennia ago. These aren't fantasies or symbols. They're documentary evidence, dated to over 9,000 years ago, created during what geologists call the African humid period, when the Sahara received enough rain to support lakes the size of small seas. One lake, Lake Megachad, covered an area larger than the Caspian Sea, stretching across regions that are now pure sand. Rivers flowed year-round, where today only dry wadis remain. Ghostly channels that carry water, perhaps once a decade, after a freak storm. The transformation from that green world to this desert wasn't gradual erosion over millions of years. It happened within the span of human memory, fast enough that people watched it die, fast enough that the trauma of losing paradise became embedded in the stories they told their children. What caused this dramatic transformation? The answer lies in orbital mechanics, in forces so vast that human intervention couldn't have stopped them, even if ancient peoples had understood what was happening. Around 15,000 years ago, Earth's axial tilt and the precession of the equinoxes combined to intensify the African monsoons, drawing moisture from the oceans deep into the continent's interior. Rain fell in seasonal torrents, filling basins that became vast lakes, nurturing grasslands that transformed the Sahara into a green corridor connecting North Africa to sub-Saharan regions. This wasn't a brief wet spell. The African humid period lasted for thousands of years, long enough for complex ecosystems to establish, for human cultures to develop sophisticated survival strategies, for settlements to be built in locations that seemed as permanent as the Nile Valley does today. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of fishing cultures, of pottery-making communities, of people living in relative abundance in a landscape of plenty. This is the window when the Sphinx might have been carved, when its enclosure walls would have been exposed to the heavy seasonal rains that created those deep, vertical erosion channels geologists can't explain away. This is the world that might have given birth to the knowledge encoded at Giza. But around 6,000 years ago, the orbital configuration began to shift. The monsoons weakened. The rains became less reliable. The lakes began to shrink. You can see this transformation written in sediment cores, pulled from what are now dry lake beds. Layers of mud gradually giving way to sand. Pollen from trees and grasses disappearing, replaced by desert plants, and then nothing at all. The change happened over centuries, giving populations time to migrate toward permanent water sources like the Nile. But the shift was inexorable. Driven by celestial mechanics no prayer or ritual could influence. And then, 12,900 years ago, something happened that made the gradual drying look gentle by comparison. The Younger Dryas struck like a hammer blow to global climate. Within perhaps a single decade, maybe even less, temperatures across the planet plunged. The evidence from ice cores is undeniable. You can see it in the layers. A sudden shift so dramatic that scientists initially thought their data was wrong, that ice from different periods had somehow gotten mixed together, because nothing in the gradual climate record suggested change could happen this fast. But the signal appears in ice cores from Greenland, from Antarctica, from mountain glaciers around the world, all showing the same thing. Rapid, catastrophic cooling that happened almost overnight in geological terms. Ice sheets that had been retreating for thousands of years suddenly surged forward again. In North America, the Clovis culture, sophisticated hunter-gatherers who had been thriving, vanished from the archaeological record as if someone had flipped a switch. Megafauna across multiple continents went extinct. Massive die-offs of mammoths and giant ground sloths and saber-toothed cats, species that had survived previous climate shifts but couldn't adapt fast enough to this one. And in North Africa, the monsoons that had brought life-giving rain to the Sahara weakened or shifted, turning grasslands to scrub and then to sand, draining lakes that had seemed eternal, transforming paradise into wasteland within the span of a single human lifetime. The cause is still debated, but the most compelling theory involves cosmic catastrophe on a scale that makes our modern disaster movies look tame. Some researchers, analyzing sediment layers from the Younger Dryas boundary, have found evidence of massive wildfires, of platinum deposits that suggest extraterrestrial impact, of nanodiamonds that only form under conditions of extreme heat and pressure. The hypothesis is that fragments of a disintegrating comet struck the Laurentide ice sheet covering North America. Not a single impact, but multiple airbursts and ground strikes that instantly melted massive volumes of ice, flooding coastlines, dumping so much fresh water into the North Atlantic that ocean currents shut down, triggering the rapid cooling that spread across the planet. Whether or not you accept the comet impact theory, and many scientists remain skeptical, the effects are undeniable. Something happened 12,900 years ago that reset global climate and scattered human populations. And if sophisticated cultures existed before this event, if they had developed astronomy and engineering and monumental architecture during the Green Sahara period, the Younger Dryas would have destroyed almost everything except the largest, most carefully positioned stone structures built on high ground, away from coastlines that would be drowned. Now imagine you're one of the survivors. Your world has ended, not in the distant future or the mythological past, but in your own lifetime. The lakes where your people fished are drying up. The grasslands where you hunted are turning brown. The seasonal rains your ancestors relied on for generations have stopped coming. You watch your children go hungry. You watch the old ones die. You watch your community fracture as groups split off to search for water in different directions. Some head toward the mountains where springs still flow. Some follow the rivers toward the coast. And some, perhaps the largest group, concentrate along the one water source that seems reliable, the one river that still floods annually, regardless of local rainfall. The Nile. You bring with you what you can carry, tools and seeds and pottery. But more importantly, you bring knowledge, stories about the time before the catastrophe, memories of a green world that your grandchildren will struggle to believe existed. You bring skills in astronomy, because your people tracked the stars to know when the rains would come. You bring understanding of engineering, because you built structures to store water and grain. You bring organizational capability, because coordinating large groups was necessary for survival. And if your people had built monuments during the abundant times, if they had carved the Sphinx and designed the Giza layout when labor and resources were available, you bring those memories too, preserving them in stories that become mythology, in sacred texts that later generations will record as the Tepi, the first time, the age when gods walked the earth before the flood. This might explain the sudden appearance of sophisticated culture in Egypt around 3100 BC. Not because Egyptians were uniquely innovative, but because they were the inheritors, the concentration point where survivors from across North Africa brought their accumulated knowledge and rebuilt what they could from memory. The rapid development of hieroglyphic writing, of monumental architecture, of complex astronomy and mathematics suddenly makes more sense if you're not starting from zero, but recovering knowledge that was nearly lost. Rebuilding capabilities that existed before, but were scattered and fragmented by catastrophe. The Egyptian obsession with the afterlife, with resurrection, with preserving knowledge for eternity, takes on new meaning if you understand it as cultural trauma. The collective memory of a civilization that watched everything they built disappear, and were determined never to let it happen again. But here's where the archaeological challenge becomes almost insurmountable. If you want to find evidence of the people who lived through this transformation, you face problems that make detective work look simple by comparison. First, there's the question of where to look. Sea levels at the end of the Ice Age were over 100 meters lower than today, which means coastlines extended far beyond their current positions. The Nile Delta, the obvious place to build settlements because river deltas are incredibly fertile, was much larger then, stretching miles further north into what is now the Mediterranean Sea. As the ice melted, as the Younger Dryas ended, and the Holocene warming accelerated, sea levels rose, drowning those coastal settlements under meters of water and marine sediment. If sophisticated populations existed before the flood, if they built their cities in the logical places, near water and transportation routes, those cities are now underwater archaeological sites, difficult to access, expensive to excavate, protected by the same ocean that destroyed them. Second, there's the problem of what survives. Walk through any museum and you'll see the bias in the archaeological record immediately. Stone survives, pottery survives, metal survives if conditions are right. But organic materials, wood and cloth and leather and bone, those disappear unless preservation conditions are nearly perfect. The Sahara alternates between extreme aridity and occasional moisture, conditions that destroy organic remains. Bones dissolve in acidic soils, the calcium leaching away until nothing remains but a stain in the earth. Even in alkaline soils that favor preservation, 12,000 years is a long time, and factors like scavengers, microorganisms, freeze-thaw cycles, all work to break down skeletal material. Add to this the fact that most archaeological surveys in the Sahara have focused on areas near existing oases, or where modern access is easy, while the vast interior, the empty lake basins, the regions buried under sand dunes, remain largely unexplored. Third, there's the question of burial practices. Not every culture buries their dead in ways that leave archaeologically visible graves. Sky burial leaves no trace once bones are scattered. Water burial leaves nothing accessible to terrestrial archaeology. Cremation reduces bodies to ash and fragments. Even simple burial without grave goods or stone markers becomes nearly invisible in the record. Just a slight soil disturbance that's easily missed during survey, especially in regions where thousands of years of wind erosion have reshaped the landscape. If pre-flood populations practiced any of these methods, we wouldn't find their bones, no matter how thoroughly we searched. Yet there are hints, fragments, that suggest human presence deeper in time than mainstream chronology acknowledges. The Nazlet Cotter skeleton, dated to 35,000 years ago, proves anatomically modern humans lived in Egypt far earlier than any civilization. Skeletal remains from Wadi Kubaniya, 18,000 years old, show populations adapting to climate change as the Ice Age ended. These aren't evidence of pyramid builders, but they establish continuity, demonstrate that people were here, surviving, developing knowledge and skills across timescales that dwarf the few thousand years of recorded history. Genetic studies of modern North African populations show markers suggesting deep roots, ancestry that extends back through all the climate transitions, survivors who carried their heritage forward, even as environments transformed around them. And then there's the evidence you can't carbon date or DNA test. The evidence carved in stone and encoded in story. The rock art showing boats and hippos and grasslands where now only sand exists. The Egyptian texts describing Zep Tepi, the first time, with surprising specificity about names and roles and architectural details. Descriptions that mainstream Egyptology dismisses as mythology, but that read more like corrupted history. Information preserved by priests who no longer understood what they were recording, but maintained it anyway because it was sacred tradition, passed down from ancestors who claimed to remember the time before the flood. The monuments themselves, built with precision that suggests knowledge we struggle to replicate, aligned to stars and seasons with understanding that requires centuries of careful observation to develop, positioned to survive catastrophe as if the builders knew, either from experience or from records, that such events happen, and that only the largest stone structures endure when everything else is swept away. You turn away from the desert horizon, and you begin to understand why the absence of bones doesn't disprove the theory. It's exactly what you'd expect, given the conditions and the timescales involved. The pyramids and the Sphinx survived because stone survives, because they were built on high ground away from coastlines, because their mass and precision made them nearly indestructible even by climate catastrophe. But the people, the settlements, the workshops, the libraries, if such things existed, those would have been built with more perishable materials, located in places that seemed logical at the time, but that are now underwater or buried under sand or covered by modern cities. The archaeological record isn't a complete inventory of the past. It's a heavily filtered sample that preserves the exceptional and loses the ordinary, that saves monuments but loses villages, that keeps stone tools but loses the wooden handles they were mounted on, that records the pyramid but erases the city of workers who built it. The lesson here is humility, not about the capabilities of ancient peoples, but about our ability to read the past from incomplete fragments. The Sahara was green, that's proven by lake sediments and rock art and fossil remains. The Younger Dryas happened, that's undeniable in ice cores and extinction events and the sudden disappearance of cultures from the archaeological record. Populations existed in North Africa during the right time frame that's established by scattered skeletal finds and genetic continuity, and the simple logic that humans lived wherever conditions permitted. Whether those populations achieved the sophistication necessary to carve the Sphinx and design Giza remains unproven by the standard of bones and graves. But the monuments themselves are evidence, massive and undeniable, of human capability at some point in deep time. And if we can't find the bodies of the builders, perhaps that tells us more about the limits of archaeology than about whether the builders existed. In the final part of our journey, you're going to step back from questions about evidence and timelines. Step back from the technical debates that may never be fully resolved, and ask what it means that these mysteries exist at all. What gift do the pyramids offer by refusing to give up all their secrets? What do we learn from sitting with uncertainty rather than rushing to premature conclusions. What does it teach us about ourselves that we're willing to invest hours exploring these questions, following evidence wherever it leads, holding multiple possibilities in mind simultaneously? The catastrophe has shown you why the record is incomplete. Now the monuments themselves will show you why that incompleteness might be intentional, why mystery might be more valuable than certainty, why the pyramids were designed not just to survive, but to make distant generations stop and wonder and question everything they thought they knew. Rest now with the image of transformation, paradise dying, populations scattering, knowledge fragmenting, but not disappearing entirely, preserved in the largest monuments and the deepest stories, waiting for the day when someone curious enough and patient enough might piece together what happened, might understand that human history is longer and stranger and more tragic and more magnificent than the comfortable narratives we've been taught. The sand holds secrets we're only beginning to uncover.
And whether we ever find all the answers matters less than the fact that we're still asking the questions, still searching, still willing to follow evidence that challenges what we think we know. The final revelation is waiting, not about when or how or who, but about why these monuments were built to outlast catastrophe, and what they're trying to teach us across the vast gulf of 12,000 years. Chapter 5. Living with Questions. You're standing alone now on the Giza Plateau, the sun setting behind the pyramids, casting long shadows across sand that glows amber in the fading light. The tourists have gone, the vendors have packed up their wares, the noise of the day has faded into silence, and you're left with just the monuments and the questions they raise. Questions that have been asked for thousands of years and still have no definitive answers. The Great Pyramid rises before you, 2,300,000 blocks of limestone and granite, each one placed with purpose we can only guess at, aligned to true north with accuracy that rivals modern surveying, containing chambers and passages whose functions remain debated despite centuries of study. The Sphinx crouches in its enclosure, weathered and worn, its body showing erosion from rains that haven't fallen here in over 10,000 years, its gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, where Leo once rose at dawn, in an age so distant that only stone could preserve its memory. And you realize, standing here in the growing darkness, that perhaps the greatest gift these monuments offer isn't answers, but questions. Isn't certainty, but wonder. Isn't the comfort of knowing, but the humility of recognizing how much we don't know. But before we talk about mystery, let me show you something that even the skeptics struggle to explain. Something discovered so recently that most documentaries haven't caught up to it yet. In 2017, researchers using thermographic imaging cameras made a discovery that shouldn't be possible. The Great Pyramid's internal temperature remains exactly 20 degrees Celsius year-round, regardless of outside weather. Not approximately 20 degrees, exactly 20 degrees. In summer, when the desert surface reaches 60 degrees Celsius, hot enough to fry an egg on the sand, the interior stays at 20. In winter, when night temperatures drop near freezing, the interior stays at 20. The stones seem to regulate temperature with precision that modern HVAC systems, with all their sensors and computers and energy consumption, struggle to match. No one knows how. No one knows why. There's no visible mechanism, no ancient air conditioning system. Just limestone and granite arranged in specific proportions that somehow create perfect thermal stability.
If you were designing a machine that needed to operate continuously for thousands of years, temperature stability would be the first thing you'd engineer, because temperature fluctuations cause expansion and contraction, stress and failure. The pyramid gives it to you automatically, built into the structure itself, using principles we still don't fully understand. That's not a tomb feature. That's engineering sophistication we're only now beginning to recognize. And here's another detail that doesn't fit the comfortable narrative. In 1993, German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a small robot up the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber, one of those narrow passages we discussed earlier. The robot discovered something unexpected. Copper fittings embedded in the shaft walls at precise intervals, and at the end of the shaft, a small stone door with 2 copper handles. Copper. Why copper in a tomb shaft that supposedly had no function except symbolism? Copper is an excellent conductor of electricity. Those fittings are positioned exactly where Christopher Dunn's power plant hypothesis predicts there should be conductive elements to channel electrical current generated by the piezoelectric granite above. When Gantenbrink published his findings, the Egyptian authorities revoked his permit and forbade further exploration. The door remains unopened, the copper fittings unexplained, a detail that mainstream Egyptology mentions rarely because it doesn't fit the tomb narrative, but that engineers find fascinating because it fits perfectly with the idea of the pyramid as machine. We live in an age that values certainty, that demands proof, that wants every mystery solved and every question answered with the confidence that comes from scientific method and empirical evidence. We're uncomfortable with ambiguity, with gaps in our knowledge, with the idea that some things might remain unknown, despite our best efforts to understand them. The pyramids challenge that mindset, refuse to yield to our need for definitive explanations, stand as reminders that reality is often more complex than our theories about it. The mainstream archaeological timeline says the pyramids were built around 2500 BC as tombs for pharaohs, and the evidence for this, the hieroglyphic inscriptions and radiocarbon dates and architectural analysis, is substantial and represents decades of careful work that shouldn't be dismissed. But the alternative theories, the ideas about much older design dates and pre-flood civilizations and purposes beyond simple burial, those theories point to evidence that's equally real, equally measurable, equally difficult to explain away. The water erosion on the Sphinx enclosure is there, visible, documented by geologists. The astronomical alignment to 10,500 BC is mathematically precise, confirmed by multiple researchers using different software. The engineering sophistication, the acoustic properties, the choice of materials with specific physical properties, the thermal regulation, the copper fittings, all of this is real and observable, and suggestive of knowledge that doesn't fit comfortably into our assumptions about what ancient peoples could achieve. The truth, if we're honest with ourselves, is probably more nuanced than either the orthodox or alternative narratives allow. Perhaps the pyramids were indeed built around 2500 BC, but according to much older plans, preserving knowledge from a time when the Sahara was green and human civilization had developed capabilities we've underestimated. Perhaps they served multiple purposes simultaneously, functioning as tombs and temples and astronomical markers, and possibly even as machines in ways we're only beginning to understand. Perhaps the Sphinx was carved in stages, the body in deep antiquity, when rainfall was abundant, and the head recarved millennia later by pharaohs who found this ancient monument and claimed it as their own. Perhaps the story of these monuments is one of continuity across catastrophe, of knowledge preserved through climate disaster, of survivors who carried memories and skills from the world before the flood and encoded them in stone for future generations to discover. The evidence supports pieces of all these theories, contradicts none of them entirely, suggests that reality is more complex than simple either-or explanations can capture. And you know what? Most Egyptologists genuinely believe the evidence points to 2500 BC, and their position isn't unreasonable given the data we currently have. The tension between competing interpretations isn't conspiracy or closed-mindedness. It's the natural state of science working at the edge of what we can prove, where evidence is incomplete and different disciplines reach different conclusions from the same fragments. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe the pyramids were designed not to provide easy answers, but to make us ask questions, to make us look carefully at evidence rather than accepting comfortable narratives, to make us recognize that human history is deeper and stranger than we've imagined. Think about what it would take to build a monument that could communicate across 12,000 years or more, across the vast gulf of time that separates one civilization from another, across language barriers and cultural changes and catastrophic events that reshape societies. You couldn't rely on writing because languages die, scripts are forgotten, texts are lost or destroyed or misinterpreted by people who no longer share your cultural context. You couldn't rely on oral tradition alone, because stories change with each telling. Details are lost, meanings shift. But if you built something massive enough to survive any catastrophe, if you encoded information in the structure itself, in proportions and alignments and choice of materials, in patterns that anyone with sufficient mathematical and astronomical knowledge could measure and analyze, then you create a message that transcends time, that speaks in the universal languages of geometry and physics, and the movements of stars that remain constant across millennia. The pyramids might be exactly that kind of message, a communication from the deep past, designed to make future generations stop and wonder and question everything they thought they knew. The mystery isn't a flaw in the design, it's the design itself. Because mystery is what makes us pay attention, what makes us look more carefully, what prevents us from dismissing these structures as simple tombs, and forces us to engage seriously with the evidence they present. If the pyramids gave up their secrets easily, if their purpose and construction methods and age were obvious, we might admire them, but we wouldn't study them with the intensity we do. We wouldn't keep returning with new technologies and new questions. We wouldn't find ourselves confronting fundamental assumptions about human capability. The mystery is what keeps us engaged, what ensures that generation after generation continues to examine these monuments, to measure and analyze and debate, to push our understanding forward, even when definitive answers remain elusive. There's a kind of wisdom in this approach, a recognition that some knowledge needs to be earned rather than simply handed down. If a civilization facing catastrophe wanted to preserve their understanding for distant descendants, they might choose to encode it in ways that require the descendants to develop sufficient sophistication to decode the message. A time capsule that opens too easily might be found by people who aren't ready for what it contains. But a time capsule that requires advanced mathematics to appreciate, that demands understanding of astronomy and precession and engineering principles, that reveals its secrets only to civilizations that have climbed back up to a certain level of scientific development. That's a more selective communication. The pyramids as a test as well as a message, revealing their deeper meanings only when we're ready to understand them. And what they're telling us, if we're listening carefully, isn't just technical information about astronomy or engineering. They're teaching us humility, reminding us that our ancestors were capable of achievements we've systematically underestimated, that the neat story of progress from primitive to advanced doesn't capture the full complexity of human history. They're teaching us to question official narratives, to look at evidence for ourselves rather than simply accepting what we're told, to hold multiple possibilities in mind without rushing to premature conclusions. They're teaching us to live with uncertainty, to recognize that not knowing can be more honest than false certainty, that mystery has value as an invitation to wonder and continued exploration. But here's what keeps me up at night. Here's the question that makes this more than just ancient history. If a civilization that advanced could lose everything in a single generation, what about us? We store all our knowledge on servers, in the cloud, on devices that won't last 50 years, let alone 12,000. We've become so dependent on electricity and internet and the complex web of infrastructure that supports our technology that a single solar flare, a major electromagnetic pulse, could send us back to the Stone Age overnight. If catastrophe struck tomorrow, if the Yellowstone supervolcano erupted, or an asteroid hit, or climate change accelerated beyond our ability to adapt, what would survive of our civilization? Would anything we've built communicate to the survivors 1,000 years from now? 10,000 years from now? Or would they stand in the ruins of our cities, looking at collapsed skyscrapers and corroded machines, and wonder if we even existed? Argue about whether we were primitive or advanced, debate whether our monuments were tombs, or had some other purpose we'd be insulted they couldn't figure out. The pyramids aren't just asking us to reconsider the past. They're asking us to think about what we're leaving for the future. What message we're encoding. Whether anything we build will last long enough to tell distant generations that we were here. We understood something important. We wanted them to know. You turn slowly, taking in the full panorama of the Giza Plateau as darkness falls completely. The pyramids silhouetted against stars that are beginning to appear in the deepening sky. Somewhere out there in the Sahara, under meters of sand, lie the remnants of the green world that existed before the catastrophe. Somewhere beneath the Mediterranean, on continental shelves that were dry land when sea levels were lower, might be the cities of pre-flood civilizations, somewhere in the genetics of modern populations, in myths preserved across cultures, in the fragmentary archaeological record, are pieces of a puzzle that could eventually assemble into a clearer picture. But even if we find that evidence, even if underwater archaeology and satellite imaging eventually fill in the gaps, the pyramids will still stand. Still mysterious, still asking us to wonder. Because the deepest mystery isn't really about when they were built or who built them. The deepest mystery is about why. About what drove human beings to invest such enormous effort in creating something that would outlast everything they knew. What vision of the future? What understanding of time's vastness? What sense of responsibility to distant descendants motivated the builders? That question touches something fundamental about human nature, about our need to reach across time, to leave something that matters, to speak to people we'll never meet.
The mystery of the pyramids is also the mystery of our own existence. The question of what we're preserving, what we're passing forward, what message we're leaving. So here's my challenge to you. Pause for a second after this ends. Don't just move on to the next video, the next distraction. Ask yourself, if you were the architect tasked with preserving knowledge for 12,000 years, knowing that catastrophe could strike at any time, that your civilization might not survive, what would you build? How would you encode what matters in a form that could outlast languages and technologies and cultural changes? What message would you send to the distant future? Drop a comment with your answer. I genuinely want to know. Because maybe in asking that question, in really thinking about it, we learn something about what these ancient architects were trying to do. Why they built the way they did. Why mystery might be the most effective way to ensure that future generations pay attention. The stars are fully visible now. The same stars that shone down on the pyramid builders, whoever and whenever they were. The same patterns that ancient astronomers tracked and encoded in stone. Orion's belt hangs in the southern sky, and if you know where to look, you can see Leo rising in the east, the same constellation that the Sphinx might have watched at dawn 12,000 years ago. The monuments are dark shapes against the star field, massive and patient, keeping their secrets, waiting for the next generation, who will bring new tools and new questions, and perhaps, finally, decode the full message. But whether that happens in our lifetime or never, the pyramids will stand, testament to human capability, markers of deep time, invitations to wonder that will continue to challenge and humble and inspire, as long as there are people curious enough to ask why. If this journey changed how you see history, hit that like button. If you want to keep exploring what we've been told versus what the evidence actually shows, you know what to do. And if you're still here, at whatever hour it is, lying in darkness, wondering what else we've gotten wrong about the past, what other monuments are trying to tell us stories we haven't learned to hear, welcome to the club. The questions don't end, they multiply. The mysteries don't resolve, they deepen. And that's not a problem to solve. It's a gift to receive. Sleep now, or let these thoughts settle, carrying with you not answers, but questions, not certainty, but wonder, not the closure of mystery solved, but the opening that mystery provides. The pyramids have given you their gift, the recognition that not everything can be known, but everything worth knowing begins with a question, with the willingness to look at familiar things with fresh eyes, with the courage to challenge what you've been told, and think for yourself. The journey doesn't end. It continues with you. With every person who stands before these monuments and feels that stirring of curiosity, that sense that there's more to the story. The stones are patient. The stars are eternal. And the mystery, beautiful and profound, remains.